Hello and welcome to I think this is the fourth installment of the Southern Syrup Research Symposium. We're joined here tonight by Kathy Smith from Ohio State University, who will be discussing woodland management for invasive species in her talk, Forest Health 101, Woodland Invaders. Just as a reminder, this is a special winter presentation series of Out of the Woods that showcases presenters from the second Southern Syrup Research Symposium that was unfortunately canceled due to COVID. The Southern Syrup Research Symposium is made possible with support from a 2017 Acer Access project titled Expanding the Maple Industry in West Virginia and the Central Appalachian Region through Research and Education, awarded to the West Virginia Department of Agriculture in partnership with WVU and Future Generations University. Just as a reminder for folks, if you have any thoughts or questions throughout the course of this talk, feel free to pop them in the chat in the Q&A. We will be letting Kathy present, and then there'll be plenty of time at the end to answer any questions. Without further ado, I'd love to hand the floor over to you, Kathy.
Okay, well, thank you. I always say that these invasive species talks can get very depressing. So try not to let it weigh on you, but you're going to learn about some plants that we need to kind of focus on. And we'll talk a little bit about eradication methods. One thing I want to point, there are some things that for some of these plants make them aesthetically pleasing. Some of them are kind of sneaky. And we'll look at a variety of different plants that we've been dealing with in our woodlands. In this front image that I have here, everything that's kind of that tannish brown standing above the green vegetation are actually seed pods from garlic mustard. And so while it looks very innocuous, you would walk past this probably, just think there's a bunch of dead weeds there. That's actually all invasive species, with the intent that if you would walk through there, you would hear the seeds pop out of those seed pods. And walking through there means that you're picking up seeds. If you're a wildlife species, you're also picking up seeds and help carrying it from point A to point B. So something to think about. A lot of times, I think that one of the things we battle with our non-native invasive species is the aesthetic issue. So in the upper left-hand corner is a hybrid bush honeysuckle that was sold for a while in the nursery trade, but creates itself naturally out in the wild between Tartarian honeysuckle and Morrow honeysuckle. It's one called Showy Fly. It has a beautiful variegated flower on it, as you can see. And again, someone not knowing would see that and maybe dig up the plant and take it home, which is what we don't want to have happen. So if you move over to your right, you're looking at flowers from autumn olive, have a wonderful smell, kind of pretty when they're hanging there early in the spring, and especially if you can catch the silvery underside of some of the leaves. In the lower right, you're looking at the flowers of kudzu. And we actually had a phone call from somebody who had been to Alabama, I think it was, and had seen some of this beautiful bloom along the highway and dug some up and brought it back to Ohio and wanted to make certain that she was taking care of the plant the right way. Not what we want to hear. And then last but not least is probably one of our more recent additions to the list of non-native invasive plants would be Callery Pear. Planted in the landscape galore. I mean, it's in many streetscapes, yards, but we found that while the initial plant was sterile, the rest of, as it crossed with some other species that we'll talk about here later, we've ended up with wild areas just full of Callery Pear. Not what we want to see. So here's a definition from invasive.org of what an invasive species is. And the bottom line is we're introducing a plant that has not grown here or grown where you are and has a tendency to be very aggressive in growth, maybe produces a lot of fruit seed, and when it's introduced into the ecosystem, it starts pushing out the native plants. So you see it becoming the dominant plant instead of something that's been there, for decades. It's something we need to pay attention to. Sometimes it does at first seem very innocuous, but I think that in the long run, you realize that all of a sudden you have the area full of one species instead of the diversity that you started out with. So where do they come from? There's a lot of places that these plants come from. Sometimes you end up with seeds on carriers and the containers. The wildlife move them around. We as humans are very good at moving them around. Prime example is I just had a former student email me with a list of trees that he's working for a livestock company, and they wanted to plant a tree that represented different parts of where the company was from. I think he had 6 different tree species. Only 2 really were quote unquote native to Ohio. The other ones were all South American, which I just didn't think they would survive the winter. But here they were doing what they felt was a neat thing that represented their company, but they were going to try to introduce a bunch of non-native trees that we don't know how they would do. I have my suspicions on some of them because of their growing zones. But, they start out with one representation and we could end up with thousands in a very short span of time. Some of these plants have been introduced for the best of intentions. Medical uses, culinary. When you talk garlic mustard, that's definitely a culinary. Medicinal was things like Ailanthus. Horticultural and landscape. Erosion control was kudzu, which is what is in this photo. And kudzu was also introduced as a forage. USDA used to recommend planting kudzu as a forage plant. And I would argue that most of the folks living in the houses across the street probably do not realize what they're looking at in that green foliage across the road. So what do? Well, here's a very large bush honeysuckle plant. And what looks like this maybe in your backyard, beautiful fruit, pretty blooms in the spring, ends up like this out in the woods eventually. So everything you see here in that light green color is bush honeysuckle. This young forest stand is just struggling. There's very little reproduction. Everything in the understory pretty much is bush honeysuckle. So it impacts the trees in so many ways and stops other plants from being available in the ecosystem. So some of the things that we know is that they can disrupt traditional pollinator relationships because a lot of our non-native invasive plants bloom early. And so it kind of throws a lot of our pollinators off track because they're available a little earlier and maybe a little more desirable in some aspects. You see very little forest regeneration when you have an understory that is full of some of these plants. No young seedlings or very few young seedlings, depending on the plants that you're looking at. They also compete with the existing trees for nutrients and water. So in a drought year, most of your non-native invasives are going to take all the water they can get, which puts a lot of stress on the established older trees because they're competing with a plant that has a shallower root system and can get to that stuff first. And in a lot of places, if you're a mushroom hunter or you enjoy your spring wildflowers, these non-natives can eliminate some of those understory plants. I have a section in my woods that is very heavy with garlic mustard. I'm working on it gradually, but what I've lost in some of those areas are the trillium that I used to have in the spring. And so it's not something that I, want to see, but you got to work on it with the time that you have and try to knock it back. Whether the trillium come back or not, only time will tell. Some of the other impacts of these non-native invasives also impact our wildlife. So what we know with the cardinal is that a healthy cardinal mate has brilliant red plumage. So you can see him here, he's gorgeous. That says to the female that he's healthy and he should be a good mate for her. But urban birds especially can have huge diets that are full of honeysuckle and multiflora rose, berries that are very red, and they create this false red color to their plumage. And so it's not as good of an indicator of how healthy or what kind of quality mate that bird will make. And so some of the concerns is we have unhealthy birds that end up brilliant red for the wrong reasons, mate and perhaps pass on genetic issues that we don't want passed on, or just are not quality mates, and you don't end up having a good egg hatch because of the match. And so that's something that a lot of us never really thought about, but some of our wildlife research that was done around the Columbus area, this was kind of an eye-opener that we just really hadn't thought about. Oh, and there's always the fun ones, right? When we talk about ticks. So it seems like at the moment, the research is telling us that the forests that have a heavy understory of barberry or honeysuckle, I think there's some other ones, we could probably look at the privets and all of those that create that heavy understory that holds in moisture, promotes great tick habitat and great habitat for tick-borne diseases with the mice that are part of the system. And so in a research project in Connecticut, they took the understory, which was barberry, out in one section of the woods and left it in another, and the tick population numbers were phenomenal, the difference between the two. So another reason, even health-wise, why we should be thinking about getting rid of some of these woodland invaders. So we're going to focus on plants tonight. We could do a whole nother hour or more on the insects and diseases that we're talking about today. But I have this picture here from one of our wildlife sociology faculty, Jeremy Brescotter. He's very proud of this photo, and when he took it, he was very proud of it, showed it to all of his friends, and one of his buddies was like, "Do you know what all that purple flowered stuff is?" And he's like, "No, but isn't it gorgeous?" So it's purple loosestrife. In that wetland area that he was photographing was just packed full of this non-native invasive species. So that's the battle, I think, that we fight when we talk about removing and targeting some of these non-native invasive species. Folks see something like this and it's just gorgeous, not really realizing all the damage that's being done underneath. So let's focus on some plants. Garlic mustard is one of those that's pretty common, unfortunately, around a lot of our woodlands. As I said in the very beginning, that front photo, here, everything that's kind of that tannish brown are the second, so it's a biennial, and it's that second year's growth with all the seeds sitting in there in all those seed pods. So it typically is the second year you have this white flower with 4 petals. Seed pods start to form. They're produced somewhere in about mid-July into late July, sometimes earlier, depending on the season. So that's the second year, and they die after they form that seed. So the first year, they're just a green basil floret on the ground that I'll show you some pictures of, that you walk past because you don't think anything of it. It's the second year that you see this flower and you'll see the fruit or the seeds. The seeds are small and black, and an average plant has a little over 100 seeds per plant. They have a lifespan in the soil of about 5 years. Oops. So it's a case of even if you pulled them all today when they looked like this, you would still have another 5 years worth of seed sitting in the soil just waiting for its ripe opportunity to grow. And so you want to make certain that you keep that in mind, that it's not a one and done. You're going to remove them if you pull them this year. You're probably going to have more to pull next year. And it can be sprayed with something like a glyphosate. We'll talk a little bit about application methods towards the end of the presentation. But realize that if you're going to do that, you're probably also going to kill some other things because a glyphosate product would not target just the garlic mustard. But you can pull it. If you got a lot of friends, invite them over for a garlic mustard pull and see if they can help you get rid of a lot of the plants in the woods. Then we have the bush honeysuckles. And so this is that showy fly honeysuckle. You can kind of see that variegated bloom in the background. Tartarian is typically more red. Amer has a different leaf shape to it, a little larger than Tartarian and Marrow and showy fly. You can kind of see it has a very pointed tip. Blooms for Amer are typically more white. For Marrow, they're a little more off-white. And then you can see, again, another one that's the showy fly, or sometimes known as bells. But Tartarian, typically that red, more red than the pink you see for showy fly. The honeysuckles can be fairly large. Amer can get upwards of 20 feet in height. They thrive in full sunlight, but they can be tolerant of shade, which is what gives them such good structure in the woods, because yes, they leaf out and bloom before the leaves are on the tree, so they suck up all that early sunshine. But once the leaves come out, they still survive because they can tolerate some shade. They typically start at the edge of the forest and move their way in, primarily, coming in where the birds are roosting and leaving seed behind, or something else carrying seed farther into the woods. Ailanthus, or tree of heaven, you can kind of see here along the roadway, kind of the long, almost sumac looking leaves, can be fairly decent sized trees and very prolific at seeding. So we're talking 300,000 plus seeds a year from a mature tree. It's phenomenal. And this time of year, these seeds that you can see in the image here are a dark tan, hanging on the trees if they're still there, and just very prominent. Can grow 12 feet a year. Produces an allelopathic compound. So it produces a compound in the soil that inhibits other plants from growing close to it and competing with it. We see them grow from sidewalk cracks and gutters, to very prolific in our forests. It was an introduced landscape plant, partially because it's so hardy that it'll grow just about anywhere. And so it was introduced as kind of an urban street tree. Still early on had medicinal uses and some soil stabilization that also was used for. So some key characteristics, you can kind of see how large on the left there the twigs are. Rule of thumb always is, if I've got a leaf that can get up to 36 inches in length, I have to have a twig that is sturdy enough to hold the weight of that leaf. It's a pinnately compound leaf. And so the next picture over, and then the one in the upper right, are different maturity stages of the leaf. The reddish one is a young leaf, but I wanted to be able to show you these glandular teeth, the bumps on the back, that make it different than a sumac leaf or a walnut leaf, which sometimes folks try to confuse them with. So you have these glandular teeth. And then up in that right-hand corner, you actually have 1, 2, 3, 4. There's 5 glandular teeth on the back of that leaf as that leaf gets more towards maturity, they don't stand out quite as much, but they're still there, still part of that keying process. Now, I don't personally think that the flowers are extremely showy, but I have had pushback from some homeowners that have them and love them, and beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And so blooms, as I said, I don't think are particularly showy, but you can see them there. And then the bark, kind of smooth, doesn't get deeply ridged or anything, stays pretty thin. And I want to caution everybody. So if you have Tree of Heaven on your property and you think you're going to work on it, be careful about exposing yourself to the sap of the tree. We have seen some inflammation of heart muscles with folks that have ended up in the ER. Here's just a few of kind of the conditions you may have if you've exposed yourself to the sap. So I always recommend that you not have any broken skin, any wounds of any sort that the sap can get into. I mean, we've had people end up in the emergency room from hand pulling young seedlings. So caveat here, be careful of this one and make certain you do the right thing when it comes to trying to remove it. Autumn olive. Autumn olive is one of those plants that was planted and introduced for all the right reasons. For us in Ohio, it was one of our strip mine recommendations because it's a nitrogen fixing plant. And so our Southeast Ohio corridors where we had strip mines, autumn olive was on the planting list because of that. Also ended up on a lot of planting lists because of the berries on it for wildlife food. But unfortunately, it didn't stay where folks planted it. And today we have it everywhere across the state. Some areas thicker than others. It invades much like honeysuckle does. I don't think it's as shade tolerant as honeysuckle is, but it definitely has some tolerance. It loves harvested areas. So if you're having a timber harvest, you want to make certain you take care of this plant prior to the harvest, because it will probably just explode in those canopy gaps that you create if you have a harvest. The fruit is this red berry that has white silvery speckles on it. The leaves are dark green above and they have silvery scales on the underside. So in the spring, when this one starts to leaf out, it's really noticeable because the wind catches both the dark green side and the silvery condition of the underleaf. And it's just, I don't want to say it sparkles, but it definitely has an eye-catching gleam to it with the silvery underside. So one to pay attention to. Like I said, it's a great nitrogen fixer. The berries are pretty decent nutrition-wise, unlike honeysuckle that are not. Honeysuckle are kind of like fast food for wildlife. Autumn olive berries are a little more nutritional, but that doesn't mean that we want them to stay around. There's the flowers that I showed you earlier. It can get upwards of 20 feet in height. You can see kind of those elliptical, egg-shaped, dark green above, silvery below, and the flowers are in these clusters and very long, kind of bell-shaped. They do have a fragrance to them. Some people can't smell it. Others, it's very fragrant too. So it just, I guess, depends on your nose and how sensitive you are to some smells. Its companion plant that sometimes gets mixed in is Russian olive. And so Russian olive is less of a shrub and more of a small tree. And you can see the leaves are silvery both above and below. Flowers are not as big and bell-shaped. They still have kind of a bell shape to them, but they're a very small bloom. And the fruit is this yellow, hard fruit. And so we have both that have been planted and are growing around Ohio. I would say though, for us, autumn olive is much more prevalent than what you'll find Russian olive. If you look at the research, most of the time they talk mostly about autumn olive east of the Mississippi, Russian olive more west of the Mississippi. We're not real certain if that was due to settlers taking the Russian olive west and not taking autumn olive west, but there's definitely a difference between the two. Some states have both on their non-native invasive plant list. Just need to look at if your state has an invasive plant list to see if they both are on there, or just one or the other, or maybe neither. Then we have buckthorns, and this is kind of an interesting conundrum I think we're going to hit here. So we have common buckthorn on the left, and you have glossy buckthorn on the right. Both of them have been discussed as non-native invasive plants. You can kind of see the inner bark has a brilliant orange cast to it. There's a thorn there for the common. Fruit has different colors when you look between the two. And the discussion has been, at least here in Ohio, as we've worked on our invasive plant list, is that both of them are initially on the list. So now there's some discussion about taking glossy off the list. And I say it's an interesting conundrum because Pennsylvania is just talking about putting it on their invasive plant list. So there's different ways that every state looks at these things, but these can become truly nuisance plants. They both like kind of wet areas, so vernal pool areas. And the problem with the buckthorns is that they can change your soil pH. So where I've worked with metro parks that are dealing with removal of buckthorns, you know, their intent initially was to go back in and restore what the native vegetation was. But if the buckthorn was there long enough, you need to do some soil tests, because if the pH has changed, those older native plants that you want to see back in there may not grow in this newly modified soil. So just like honeysuckle can leave some compounds behind that changes some soils, structures, buckthorn is also one of those that can have an impact on the soil that you can't just think about yanking it out or cutting it off and killing it and putting back in what was there prior to the buckthorn. So check out the soils and see where you are. There's kind of the difference between the two. So for me, it's usually the leaf veins that really give it for me. Is common has these leaf veins that arc towards the tip, and the leaf margin has a little bit of a tooth to it. Glossy buckthorn, the leaf veins tend to go straight out to that leaf edge and not have that toothed appearance. And so there are those subtle ways to tell them apart. It'll be interesting to see how we deal with it here and how other states deal with it when it comes to putting these plants on the invasive plant list. Then we have Callery Pear. So Callery Pear is probably one of our newer ones that we've been paying attention to. I would say, 15 years ago, one of my colleagues in Northwest Ohio called me one day, and she was describing this pear that had taken over this guy's property that he had. And I couldn't wrap my head around it. I hadn't seen anything like this image. And so I was up her way one day and I said, hey, let's go look at that site. So this picture is actually from that site. The guy had a 33-acre property that he wanted to turn into an arboretum. This property sits on the backside of the city of Sylvania, and Sylvania's streets are lined with Callery Pear. So every green little tree you see in this image is a pear. I had never seen anything like this before. His 33 acres was just almost completely solid with young pear seedlings, saplings. So what's the deal? Because Callery Pear was supposed to be sterile. Well, it was, but then what we did was we added things like Cleveland Select and Bradford and some of the other pear varieties that had better branching patterns, maybe better fall color, And when we started adding those, we started getting crosses. So what we know now is that they have been able to cross-pollinate and they are producing viable seed. And sometimes these original trees were grafted. So the rootstocks may have sprouted from the base. And so it produces some shoots that then form into a tree that's got enough material, flowers, and everything to produce, another tree somewhere else to pollinate. And so we've got areas in Ohio, like that first area, that traffic along I-75, that are just solid. There's sections along the highways that are just solid in the spring with blooming pear. Now, probably 95% of the drivers think it's gorgeous, but for those of us know what the plant is, just makes you want to cringe, because they are just everywhere and everyone now seems to be dealing with them. For Ohio, it is not currently on our invasive plant list, but it will go on the list next year, making it a plant that no longer can be sold out of the nurseries in Ohio. So here are some of those examples. The upper one where you can see all the wires along the highway, you got to try to find that perfect spot, right, to photograph these things. So this area was traditionally a lot of conifers, and you can see that these pear have kind of sat underneath some of those conifers and have now blown up through the conifers. And just maybe 4 years ago, 5 years ago, around the 1st of April, I was heading around Columbus on the bypass and down State Route 315, and it looked like, ODOT had planted pear from top to bottom, and it was gorgeous. But it also, knowing what the plant was, just made me cringe. The little seedling you see is in our Don Scott woods that sits behind a commercial area, a Home Depot, a Sam's Club, and their parking lot islands are full of pear. So they're coming in the woods, and we're trying to be diligent about staying ahead of it. Here's some of the typical fruit, but I can tell you I have also seen Callery Pear sprouts producing almost fruit pear shaped fruit. So kind of depends on what they pollinated with, but you can get different size fruit, but this is pretty typical for a lot of them. And then just another picture farther up outside of the Columbus Beltway, that is an area that the city of Delaware stopped mowing along the highway. As you can see, it's now just all pear. Paulownia, known as princess tree, royal paulownia, empress tree. I think there's a lot of other names that it can be called, some good, some not so good. But it's a smaller tree, but look at one tree can produce 20 million seeds. So in Southern Ohio, Kentucky, I would assume that there's probably sections of West Virginia that fall into that same range, where the paulownia is just coming in canopy gaps right and left. It loves disturbed areas. 12 feet of growth a year is pretty typical. And so it doesn't take it very long to become a dominant tree in our forested areas. You can see dinner plate sized leaves, just huge, heart shaped. The blooms are usually, again, that aesthetic that attracts people. Beautiful flowers. I did a Master Gardener program and was talking about some of these, and I had a very sheepish Master Gardener come up to me after the talk and said, "We just brought 2 of those trees back from North Carolina. What am I going to do with them?" And I said, "Not plant them." I don't know what she ever did, but I can tell you then, a year or 2 later, we were on a trip for the ANREP Extension Conference. Yeah, and you don't want to ride in a vehicle with a bunch of extension people that deal in invasive plants because that's all they do while you're driving down the road. Oh, look, there's kudzu. There's the Paulownia pods are just so prominent. We had never seen them like that along some of the highways in Tennessee and North Carolina. So it's an interesting plant, just very prolific, unfortunately, can just push out a lot of our native tree species, which isn't good. There is a Paulownia association that promotes planting Paulownia. It's a carver's wood. So initially it was brought to this country to be sold back to places like Japan for carvings, for delicate carvings, but that business proposition never really worked out. You can find Paulownia boards in some of the home stores that have lumber. You just have to know what you're looking for. But we would rather see it. If you want to make it into boards on its way out of your woods, I'm okay with that. I just don't want to see it reproducing in your woods. Kudzu, this is the one, when I was in college many, many years ago, we talked about kudzu as one of those southern plants that was taken over the South. But once established, it can grow 60 feet a year. I feel like you should be able to sit there and just watch it grow, right? Your taproot on it can be 7 inches in diameter and 6 feet in length. So once this plant gets started, it's incredibly difficult to get rid of. And so the bloom that attracted the lady to dig it up from the side of the highway and bring it home is not something that we want folks to do. It served a purpose when it was introduced. As I said, it was used as forage for livestock. That was one of the things that it was introduced for, and erosion control. So it had some great uses, but not something we really want to utilize in those scenarios today. 1876 is a forage plant, widely planted, even up through the mid-50s by USDA. It was on their forage list of plants. And if you look, I did a talk for the pesticide recertification a few years ago. And one of these guys, I've known the guy in the bottom picture for most of my career. Walt came up to me afterwards. He says, I'm going to send you some pictures. So this was St. Clairsville, Ohio. They'd gotten a contract to try to eliminate everything green in these 2 photos, which is kudzu. And I don't know, I haven't talked to Walt since he gave me the photos, but I'm sorry, a 3-gallon backpack sprayer and all of that green vegetation just makes me think that this job might not have been as successful as he had hoped, because that's a lot of kudzu. Chinese or Asian or Oriental bittersweet is another one that we're dealing with in a lot of the country. And sometimes we have a lot of folks that just think bittersweet, right? Native bittersweet. Nah. So the Oriental was introduced, and unfortunately now the Oriental and our American bittersweet are crossing. So they're hybridizing, which makes it a tough call about removing it from your woodland or, whatever area you're looking at. You can try to key them. Most of the hybrids are going to have characteristics of both varieties. And so for me, I usually tell landowners, you have to decide how aggressive it's being. If it's being so aggressive that you're losing some trees and losing other vegetation and it's just taken over, then it probably needs to go. If it's coexisting and not really being that aggressive, then you're probably more of the native variety than the non-native, and you could work with it. So you're going to have to pay attention to it if this is something you're battling. Barberry is another one. It's one that we are dealing with quite a bit in Ohio. What happened was it was introduced at one point into the US, the version that's non-native, to deal with the wheat rust. And so barberry is part of the cyclical process for rust on wheat. And so it's that secondary host. And we replaced the native with a non-native that was not as prominent in that cycle. The problem is that it just overtook everything. And as it crossed with some of our native, it became, again, that secondary host for rust on wheat. Several years ago, USDA called me to see if we knew how much barberry was coming back, because there had been a national eradication program for barberry, which was pretty successful. But, you know, if you don't keep up on it, it all comes back. And that's what we're starting to see again. We're finding it in our sugar bush on our OSU Mansfield campus, and it's on our to-do list for this year. Euonymus or winged burning bush is probably one that most folks haven't talked about yet, but as we're seeing research being done in Southwest Ohio, I can tell you that what the foresters say is that you remove the bush honeysuckle and the next plant in is burning bush. And so again, a plant that's been just planted everywhere in the landscape because of that brilliant red fall color. It just doesn't stay there. And so it's another one that I think will end up on our invasive plant list here in the next couple of years. Privet, there's multiple varieties of privet out there, Japanese, Chinese, and in some areas it's very dominant, and in other areas you don't see it at all. So it's one I would put on your radar to pay attention to. All of these, if you don't have them now, and have them on your radar so that you can stop them before they become a dominant understory plant. Japanese honeysuckle vine is another one that has blooms on it a good portion of the year. It have blooms and fruit at the same time. And so it looks great on fences and things like that. And I find that I get, you know, landscape folks that want this in the landscape, but can just become a nightmare. So there are the blooms, some of the leaves, and usually very dark fruit, kind of hard to see here. It's right at the edge of the one leaf, almost black fruit, but you can have fruit and flowers at the same time. So it kind of tells you how much it pushes its growth. Japanese stilt grass. I always say that this is the grass that forced the U.S. Forest Service to put in wash stations for equipment, because they were seeing stilt grass just pop up everywhere in the national forests. And what they've done is they've put wash stations in that if you're a contractor and you're working in stand A and you're moving to stand B, you have to go through the wash station. All of your equipment has to be washed down so that you're not carrying seed to the next point. And so it was the plant that kind of spurred that, but it's also one of those that I think is so very innocuous. I mean, look, you got grass growing down through your woods. What else? You know, that looks kind of nice. The problem is that nothing else will compete against it, and all you'll have is that carpet of stilt grass. So let's switch gears a little bit and just go over some control methods. Mechanical, I have a lot of landowners I work with that are not interested in using chemicals, and I get that. My caveat for just doing mechanical is that you are going to have to outlast the plant. That's just the bottom line. You're going to have to outlast the plant and continue to pull and pull and pull, strip bark off of things or cut things off, pull things out until the plant, its energy reserves, you know, disappear. So here is that piece of equipment you could see in the upper corner pulling out a plant. This is one of our bobcats at Farm Science Review Grounds. Let me do, and our farmer on the site was having a grand time with his new piece of equipment. So Nathan cleared about 3/4 of an acre of bush honeysuckle in about 24 to 30 hours, something that we had been working on for several years using student labor. More drastic, pulling all that out. He actually pulled out trees that we had planted in there. So he pulled good stuff with bad stuff. And that was just because he was having a little bit too much fun, just yanking everything out of the ground. There are other tools that you can use to yank stuff. This is called a BrushGrubber, and there's different sizes for different plants that you're dealing with. Foliar sprays is typically what we talk about with maybe smaller plants. The lower photo is an old Forest Service photo, and I don't recommend. The guy has no protection on, the horse has no protection on. Not what I would recommend for foliar spraying today. And the gentleman in the right hand, I mean, he's got a cap on, he's got eye protection on, he's got gloves on. He's still spraying over his head, which probably isn't the best scenario, but foliar sprays work well as long as you're not worried about killing non-target species, that you realize you're going to hit some things that maybe are desirable, but you want to do a foliar application. Sometimes for things in woodlands, I've got landowners that do a two-step process where they go in and cut off everything in the understory. And when it sprouts back, they come back in and do a foliar application. You can do a much more targeted application this way. You're not spraying, massive areas that you then have to wait to die and cut off and move your way in the woods. This is a different approach. Takes a little more labor because you're making 2 trips back into the stand. And so there can always be issues. This is autumn olive that we're spraying on our outside of our sugar bush area at Mansfield. And I'm one of those that says if you're going to do foliar application on non-native invasive plants, most of them have a good waxy coat, and you need to do some kind of surfactant. But what we hit here is Mother Nature at its best with a nice gust of wind in the middle of application. And so understand what your risks are, your overspray, and move out if Mother Nature isn't going to play along. Basal bark, you can do the lower 12 to 18 inches of a smooth bark tree. The rougher the bark, the harder it is for the chemical to penetrate. You can do single stem trees like you see here. You can also do multi-stem shrubs. You just have to make certain that you get the spray around the entire plant line. So if it's a multi-stem, all the stems have to get sprayed all the way around. Can be a little more intense than a single stem, but can be used. And here you can see that Gabe cut out everything else around it, and we just did the stem area there of some Ailanthus that was coming up in the middle of some pollinator plots for one of our extension county areas. Hack and squirt. Hack and squirt is probably the one application that doesn't get used as much on non-native invasive plants, but it does have its places where it can be used, where you're making a cut into the tree or the shrub and you're injecting the chemical directly into the plant, either with something like this old Jim that is still around, but I don't know of anyone that really uses them anymore. Most folks use just a hatchet and a squirt bottle in order to make the right depth of cuts and then squirt the chemical right into that fresh cut. Cut stump, you have 2 options if you're going to cut the plant off and treat the stump. If you're going to use a water-soluble chemical, then you want to cut the stump and immediately treat. The longer you wait between cutting and treating, the less successful the treatment will be. If it's not the right weather conditions to spray, you can cut and come back with a chemical that is carried in an oil that will penetrate the bark. And at that point, you're going to spray that old cut surface and all the way down to the root collar in order to have a successful kill. So for here, we did a small autumn olive. And then treated the stump. So those are most of the methods. I've got a couple of resources here for you. We have this fact sheet, Relative Effectiveness of Herbicides Used on Woody Vegetation. You can find it from our Woodland Stewards website. I just recently had it gone over and everything is still good. I just need to get it updated into the new branding for Ohio State. But it is on our Woodland Stewards website. It has lists of some plants. It's not going to have everything. Talks about which chemicals are most effective in the method that you want to apply. And the other is a fairly new resource, Woody Invasives. Woody Invasives of the Great Lakes Collaborative. So there's a group of us, multiple states, that have contributed to this site to help make kind of a one-stop shop for some woody invasive control. So you can see a management and control tab, one that talks about the different species. We hope that we continue to add to this. It was launched late 2020 into 21, so it was launched during COVID, and we really haven't had a great amount of time to focus on it, but it's an option out there for you to get more information, maybe more targeted to the plants that you're trying to control. And with that, I probably will stop there and see what kind of questions we have.
Thank you very much, Kathy. If y'all have any questions for Kathy, go ahead and populate them into the chat. I see one. Paul Ronk was wondering if you have any suggestions for beech trees and controlling sort of the beech brush we end up with.
So one of the things that you have to think about with beech is that it's not an easy tree to kill in the beginning. And so, you know, all the stuff that comes up is just a result of not killing the initial mother plant, so to speak, correctly. So it's if you're trying to kill the tree so that you don't end up with the sprouts, you want to do a double girdle and definitely a deep girdle. So maples are the same way, diffuse porous trees, you have to go deep because otherwise they'll just grow over and continue to thrive if you don't get all of the material cut and treated. There's a lot of herbicides that will work well on beech. I would pull up that fact sheet that I gave you that showed you the title to. It will have beech in there and make some recommendations on what works best. But it really is, you know, you want to be able to kill the big tree so that you don't have all the sprouts. If you have the sprouts anyhow, you still probably, if you could go through and cut them all off and just generally kind of do what you would do for a cut stump and treat it, hopefully with the right chemical, it'll go down and it'll kill the roots.
I'm not talking. Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Thank you so much, Kathy. We had one pop up in the chat. It says advice for controlling multiflora rose.
It's kind of funny is that I don't focus a lot on multiflora rose because in a lot of cases it's, you know, kind of the least of our worries, but I have multiflora rose. We actually, on the OSU campus, the library is named after Louis Bromfield, who introduced multiflora rose. So the campus has a lot of it. So there's a couple ways of looking at multiflora rose. If you can get the canopy, so if you're in a wooded scenario, if you can get the canopy to close, it will shade out the multiflora. And so it's a matter maybe of working more with getting the canopy to get some height and some closure. I've done that in my, I had a riparian buffer that I planted. I mowed for the first 2 or 3 years between the rows of trees, but between the trees, I had multiflora rows coming in. And at first I started whacking at it and treating it. But what I realized was the deer couldn't get to my seedlings through the multiflora rows. So what I ended up doing was kind of cultivating the rows around the trees once they got above it. And now they're shading it out. And I also have rose rosette disease that's knocking some of it out. So there are, you know, there's some options there. There are definitely some chemicals that can target rose. But what I would say is you need to know what species you have around it, because some of the chemicals that are really good on multiflora rose will also kill a lot of the tree species. So if you're trying to eliminate it around some tree species, you're gonna have to look at some labels to see, you know, if the Garlon, like Garlon 4, would probably do okay. Glyphosate will do okay, depending on, you know, what surfactant you have in it. And so there's definitely some options out there, but it's interesting that we do have a fairly easy, I shouldn't say easy because nothing's ever easy. You have a method, if you can get the canopy, if you can get the shade, you'll lose the rose, which is kind of nice. Like I said, in my case, I used it to keep the deer from just, you know, hammering away at my young tree planting.
Ooh, follow-up question to multiflora rose. Are there any success stories for eradicating any widespread invasive?
Yeah, there are. It's tough because you may be targeting your non-native invasives, but your neighbor isn't. And so in that instance, it can be frustrating, but it may also be an opportunity for neighbors to come together and work on the project together and share resources. Probably one of the biggest success stories was Barberry, when the US government, you know, did this national eradication program. There were 19 states that participated, and they hired people to go out and hand dig and pull out the barberry bushes. And it was very successful. The problem is, you know, it was kind of like, okay, you know, we're done. Let's move on. And we shouldn't have done that, because now the barberry is back in a variety of stages. So the problem is always going to be, you can have great success, but it's not success and then walk away. It's success, and now it's a part of your management routine, something that you're going to constantly monitor for and constantly work on. But it's a whole lot easier to yank 1 or 2 plants out that have resprouted versus, you know, 80 acres of some plant that you just, you know, you kind of stand there and wonder, what am I getting myself into?
Man, I keep forgetting to unmute tonight. Nice. Are there any other questions out there? Feel free to populate them into the chat. Oh, here we go. How do you control Japanese knotweed?
Be a very dedicated knotweed eradicator. So there are some methods that are better than others. I've had folks have great success with things like Garlon 4. Vastland would probably be another one. It would be another version of Garlon 3A. So there are some options out there, but again, knotweed is one of those that is just so persistent. I've got a picture in one of my other presentations for knotweed that a park district thought they had it all eradicated, and they put some loose blacktop down for a trail, only to have the knotweed just grow right up and push up through the blacktop. It's a pretty amazing photo. So it's a hard plant to kill. It's probably one of them, like kudzu, that I would put at the top of the list that are really tough. So what I have had landowners have great success with is knock it back, treat it, and then when you kind of get it to that kill stage that you think you've got, some of them cover the area with black plastic and then try to cook it out the rest of the way. I would just say that you're going to treat it, and it's, again, going to be one that you are going to treat several years in a row and hopefully have a smaller patch of it each year as you work through it, because it's a gnarly one and it does not want to die easily.
He adds in, no kidding. I was about to say, anybody who's experienced knotweed before knows full well.
Yeah. Knotweed and kudzu are just one of those. Oh, and there's one. Bamboo. You can add bamboo to that list. It's just, there's just not a simple way. It's going to be, I mean, I had one lady in the city of Columbus that had bought a house. Her neighbor had planted bamboo in the backyard, and of course it had moved into her backyard. She spent something like $3,000 or $4,000 digging it out of the backyard. And of course it still comes in from the neighbor's yard, trying to put up barriers. I have a colleague that says, if you're going to plant bamboo, you have to plant it in a container so it can't go anywhere. Most folks don't do that, and it ends up everywhere. Again, bamboo is going to be one of those that you're going to treat and treat and treat until you outlast the plant.
The good old theory of control one invasive with another one. I-91.
Yeah, no, don't go there.
Yeah, I was about to say that goes for plants and critters.
Yes, think starlings.
Oh, no kidding.
Or Asian lady beetles, all introduced for the right reason, but we're living with them now.
No kidding. Anybody else out there have any questions for Kathy Smith as we're wrapping up here? I want to echo what Lindsay said at the start. Thank you so much for coming in and giving this talk. I know.
No problem.
Invasives are often something that is on the forefront of everybody's mind, but we rarely ever know where to start. So I appreciate it.
Well, hopefully this was a good kind of intro. I mean, there's a lot more we can do. If you want to go more in depth on things and chemical control and that, we can always do that. I didn't want to pile on all the chemical stuff. One would be because the multi-state thing, that always gets a little tricky, but we can always delve deeper into chemicals if that's what folks want.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Kathy. I know it's chemical warfare, man. It's out there.
Well, and it's hard to tell people, as you know, I said in the beginning, I have a lot of landowners that I talk to on a regular basis. Some of them are willing to do chemicals. Some of them have no interest in doing chemicals. I'm fine. I'd much rather you err on the side of caution. The last thing I want to do is put a chemical in your hand that you are not comfortable with, because that never leads us to a good place. And so I have one gentleman who has a 5-acre woods who goes out every day for an hour and strips the bark off of his bush honeysuckle. Now, he's got a whole lot more patience than I do, because I'd have been whacking things down way before I've been stripping off bark, but it works for him. And I'm okay with that. He made that decision. He didn't want to treat. So there are those options out there. We can always explore them. And if you need a more kind of pesticide oriented chemical talk, we can always do that. And we should probably also talk about the insects at some point, because they're doing a job on us too.
Whew, yeah, I was about to say, it seems like we might be heading for part 2 here pretty soon.
Anytime.
I appreciate it. Well, I'm going to go ahead and launch our exit poll. Just tell us what you thought of the webinar. Thank you so much all for coming. If you're looking for more Maple resources, you can always find us at future.edu/maple. You can reach out at syrup@future.edu. And then for some in-person events, we have a sanitation workshop coming up next weekend on the 26th at Tom's Creek Maple in Wayne, West Virginia. We have that same workshop running on the 2nd up at Family Roots Farm in Wellsburg, West Virginia. And then we have one on the 23rd of April down at Laurel Fork Sapsuckers in Highland, Virginia. So we'd love to come see y'all there if everybody can make it. We'll be working on sanitizing sap lines. Excellent. Well, I really appreciate everybody coming out tonight. I know we're near the end of maple season for a lot of us, and it's about to calm down, but it's not quite calm yet. So I appreciate y'all making the time.
And also just a reminder, our next webinar will be Thursday, April 21st, and our speaker will be Abby Vandenberg.
Thanks, Kathy.
You're welcome. Anytime.
Thanks so much, Kathy.
See you guys later.
Good night, everybody.